Welcome to Taking the High Road, a special show dedicated to the trucking industry, specifically at the confluence of recruiting, retention, and compliance. In the 4th year as the host of this show, I bring over 2 decades of industry experience, both on the carrier side as well as the vendor side. And each week I interview industry experts and thought leaders who bring their insight to the driver lifecycle as we discuss the industry's greatest challenges. I always appreciate your feedback, good or bad. Don't forget to leave a rating and a review. I'd also like to thank and highlight the show's valuable sponsors. Their dedication and commitment to the industry and to the show is greatly appreciated. If you're interested in being a sponsor or joining me for an interview, please email Jeremy at takingthehighroad.com. This week, I'm honored to be joined by a great friend and subject matter expert, Brandon Wiseman, transportation attorney and president of Trucksafe Consulting, as we discuss some important compliance-related updates that are quite relevant to this show's audience. Welcome to the show, Brandon. Great to see you again.
Hey, Jeremy. Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you are a regular guest, and so I know we've got a lot to get into today as there's a lot going on in trucking from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. We've got some updates with the Clearinghouse to unpack. We've got a new administration starting next year, so I'm sure there's something to discuss with that. And I'd like to get an update on drug testing. Where do we stand with saliva and or hair follicle testing, and I'm sure much more. But before we get down into those weeds, let's talk about you and the work that you're doing at Trucksafe, because although you've been a repeat guest, I think, if you don't mind, just sharing with the audience what Trucksafe's all about, and perhaps we can get into some additional offerings that you're providing the industry with your expertise.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate it. So Trucksafe is a DOT consulting company that I started with a partner of mine back in 2021, along with a small law firm called Childress Law. And so through both of those companies, our goal is to help trucking companies and bus companies of all types and sizes stay in compliance with the multitude of safety regulations that apply to their business and keep them safe and compliant and out of the crosshairs. So we do that several different ways. We push out a lot of content ourselves through our own podcast, and we have our Trucksafe Compliance Network. It's a kind of a forum for safety professionals to gather together and ask questions and learn from one another. And then also through eRegs, which is a software company that we launched more recently. It is a digital version of the federal safety regulations where fleets and their drivers can easily access an up-to-date version of the regulations and not just read through the regulations, which is important, but also have access to all of our content that we've developed over the last several years that helps them to better understand those regulations. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Well, it's a lot of content and a lot of expertise, certainly a lot of value to those who absorb it. And also, though, you mentioned a podcast, and I couldn't help it. As soon as you start talking and I hear your voice, I'm like, that's a radio podcast voice. So for those in the audience, I'm sure if you haven't already, it's easy to listen to, fun to listen to, especially if you geek out like Brandon and I can on compliance and safety.
Fancy microphone helps out.
It does, I'm sure, but it's also what's being projected into the microphone. So we've talked several times over the past few years about the Clearinghouse and how it's really closed a significant compliance loophole since it went online in 2020. I know it's been a bit bumpy, especially in the early days and weeks, but we're now almost like 5 full years in. So just from your, in your opinion, how's it going so far, and is it working as it was intended to?
Well, I mean, anecdotally speaking, I wish more carriers actually knew about the Clearinghouse. You would think after 5 years that we would have a handle on this as an industry, but I meet with so many fleets each month that haven't even heard of the Clearinghouse, and they have somehow skated by for 5 years without complying with the Clearinghouse and their drivers as well. And so that's a little frustrating to see. But for the carriers that are using, I mean, there's certainly a big universe of carriers that are using it correctly and drivers that have registered for accounts and stuff like that. For those that are using it, it seems to be accomplishing its purpose. The Clearinghouse publishes its numbers every month, how many reports have been made of drug and alcohol violations, and how many drivers have, completed the return to duty process to get back into the truck after they've been in violation. And what we see in the most recent numbers is that there are roughly 180,000 CDL drivers currently in prohibited status in the clearinghouse, meaning they are prohibited from operating a commercial motor vehicle due to a past drug or alcohol testing violation, and they have not gone through or completed the return to duty process to be able to get back to work. And so that's a significant number. I think we've talked, like you said, we've talked about this several times. We've seen that number rise substantially since we first started talking about this a few years back. But that's where it's at. It's catching folks who have had drug or alcohol problems. So that's obviously the goal.
And I do want to get into a new loophole, or just one that's existed, since the beginning, that's going to be closing here soon. But before that, I am astounded to hear you say that there are a number that you're talking to and seeing a number of carriers not complying or even unfamiliar with the clearinghouse. And I can't help but hear this through the lens of what we've been dealing with for the last 2 years in terms of just economic, challenging environment, freight recession, and say, and also knowing that from a compliance, from a regulatory, having teeth, like this is one of the easiest things to hold somebody accountable for, because it doesn't require some on-site, visit or, any sort of, they know who's registered, who's running, queries and that sort of thing. And so I would think at the very least, some letters can go out, with some, some terse verbiage, you know what I mean? But or just fine saying, look, by December 31st, if you don't have this done, you are either going to be fined a significant amount of money, or your authority is revoked, period. Yeah. And what does that do for the rest of the industry? It's not a bad thing.
No, well, to date, the only way that I've seen the FMCSA enforce this so far is through their compliance reviews, through their audits of motor carriers. It certainly comes up in that context. If they're in there auditing a motor carrier that hasn't registered for the clearinghouse and hasn't done any of the queries on their CDL drivers, then they will be written up for violations in that audit, and they are receiving substantial fines for not doing that. But as we all know, the FMCSA is a small agency, relatively speaking, and so it just doesn't audit any significant number of carriers on a given year. And so we just don't see the reach when it comes to enforcing the clearinghouse requirement as we should be seeing. I have started to see it come up in roadside inspections occasionally. Starting to see that ramp up a little bit. Drivers driving down the road, CDL drivers driving down the road, and they're either in prohibited status due to a past violation, or no query has been run on them. Starting to see that play out in roadside inspection violations as well, and that will hopefully start to close the gap a little bit, or at least bring some more awareness to the presence of the clearinghouse requirement as drivers are starting to get written up for that roadside. But yeah, it is still a significant problem for carriers that are just not paying attention to it.
Yeah, that's insane. But like I said, there's been a ongoing loophole, and by loophole, it's not forever, but it's something that you might not catch as often as you'd like to, that it's about to be closed. Actually just is now closed as of this November 2024. Can you share just, with the audience what that is exactly and why that's relevant in going forward?
Yeah, so as of November 18th, 2024, Clearinghouse Phase 2 is now in effect. So Phase 2 closed a gap, which was that until now, the state drivers licensing agencies weren't required to check a driver's clearinghouse status when either issuing them a new CDL or renewing one or upgrading them or anything like that. And so what was happening was drivers were violating the drug and alcohol testing rules, and they were being put into prohibited status in the clearinghouse, meaning they can't drive a commercial motor vehicle. But the states were not taking what seems like the correct action under those circumstances to downgrade their CDL to a standard operator's license. There's no reason for them to have a CDL at that point because they can't operate they're disqualified from operating. But Because we haven't had that as a requirement for state driver's licensing agencies. Not every state was doing that. Somewhere, but very few, relatively speaking. And so what we ended up with were a bunch of those 180,000 drivers who were in prohibited status maintaining their CDLs, even though they were prohibited from operating. So this plays into that issue we just talked about, because then if they're in prohibited status and they go to work at one of those carriers that's not paying attention to the clearinghouse requirement and not doing the checks through the clearinghouse, they present to that motor carrier a valid CDL. And if that carrier is just checking CDLs and not the clearinghouse, it looks like that driver is good to go. But had they checked the clearinghouse, they would have seen that they were prohibited. And so effective November 18th, the states are now mandated to check the clearinghouse anytime they're completing a CDL transaction for a CDL driver. And if they see the driver's in prohibited status, then they have to either downgrade the CDL or not issue it, not renew it, that type of stuff.
So, well, if the carrier is not checking the clearinghouse, I'm afraid they may not also be overly concerned, but they should be. And hopefully they're at least running an MVR or something like that. But How is this not like this? If I'm in the, driver monitoring business, I think this is an amazing sort of opportunity for us in that space. And I say that because obviously I've always been a proponent of it. I was when I ran 500 full-time and part-time drivers. I mean, Samba Safety was the company that I worked with, and I was religious about it because I knew how important that was to make sure that at any time, if a driver's CDL was downgraded or there were infractions that, hit their license, I wanted to know, I wanted to see, I wanted to make sure they were still qualified. But this obviously that still exists, but now this is even better because if there is a drug or alcohol test failure, it's going to get pushed to that SLA, state licensing agency. And I'm going to get that update in scope of my driver monitoring program if I'm using one. Is that safe to say?
It is. Now, you should have, if you're using the clearinghouse, you should have received that notice already before the state then takes action to downgrade the license. Because nowadays, the clearinghouse, if you're using it correctly, assuming you've run at least one query on all of your CDL drivers, the system will now automatically notify you as their employer if they get put into prohibited status. Let's say they go and apply at a different motor carrier.
Even on a limited query?
Even on limited queries.
Okay. Yeah. So that was a loophole that wasn't the case.
So they closed that one earlier in 2024 or late 2023. I can't remember. Now, no matter the type of query that you run in the clearinghouse, if the driver's status changes subsequently within the 12 months after you have run that query, the system will automatically ping you and tell you that something's different, which usually means they're in prohibited status now. And so you should take action on that notice. And
not to go too far down this rabbit hole, because there's a lot more to talk about, but in that instance, if the driver, especially with turnover being as high as it is often, they may have multiple employers that have run a pre-employment full query or limited query. So in theory, all of those employers could get
pinged.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the system for 12 months after you run any query will continue to ping you if that driver's status changes.
Okay. Well, that takes a little bit of the wind out of the sails of the driver monitoring program that I was saying, but still, I think I'm a big proponent.
Your point is still a good one because, it's nice to see all of these things start to work together. Ultimately, you and I have have kind of preached this to our own separate groups over the years, but ultimately I would like to see us get to a point where continuous monitoring is required for driver's licenses for motor carriers, just because, right now the only requirement is that you run a MVR on your drivers once a year. And that is, if the driver's license status changes the day after you run that MVR, it's already stale. And that you won't know that they've lost their license unless they volunteer that information to you. And so it's a big gap, probably the biggest gap that exists in the regulations right now. And so if we were to require continuous monitoring, then that would close that gap. And now we've got the drug and alcohol violation gaps closed. So I think all of those would work well together to keep unsafe and disqualified drivers off the roads.
And I know, and I apologize to the audience because we could spend this entire show just talking about this stuff because, again, we can geek out on this. I do want to get into drug and alcohol testing, and especially because I feel like we've been talking about hair follicle testing. We've been talking about saliva testing as options to include, in addition to the current, urinalysis process. Where are we at with these additions, and are we moving at the speed of government?
Yeah, well, for oral fluid testing specifically. So the folks may recall that in 2023, a final rule was passed by the U.S. DOT that cleared the way for oral fluid testing in addition to urinalysis for DOT-mandated drug test. And that has stalled because one component of the rule has not been fulfilled, which is that in order for that to take effect, we have to have at least 2 laboratories available to process those types of tests. And so far, we haven't gotten any certified laboratories to actually process the test results for oral fluid. So we are still waiting on that. And we have been waiting on that for almost, it's either over a year or at a year at this point. And so I don't know when that's going to happen. I heard that it was supposed to happen early 2024. Obviously, that didn't happen. And so we're still waiting for that. But once we get to labs approved for that, then that will take effect and carriers will be able to use your oral fluid testing in addition to urinalysis or in lieu of urinalysis. Hair follicle testing has not moved forward to date. There have been various groups over the years that have petitioned the DOT to allow for that. And there's a lot of carriers, particularly the larger carriers in the country, that are doing those voluntarily.
In addition to
urinalysis. And but to date, it has not moved forward with any kind of proposed rule or anything like that. It's not currently on the DOT's agenda, regulatory agenda. So we're still waiting to see if that moves forward. I have no expectation that it will move forward anytime in the near future.
And can you speak just briefly to the how similar are they? Because I know one of the merits of hair follicle testing was how significantly more stringent it was in detecting any sort of usage, or and whereas I don't know, is saliva comparable?
Yeah, so I don't know the science behind the test, but if you look at the final rule for the oral fluid testing, it kind of laid out how it compared to urinalysis in terms of detection windows and stuff like that. And in my layman's estimation of it, it looked pretty comparable to urinalysis, current urinalysis. The thing with oral fluid testing, though, is that they are easier to administer, from what I understand, and the person who is administering the test is always going to be observing the test, which is the problem we have with urinalysis, which is that most of those are unobserved. The driver goes and pees in a cup and, in private, which opens the door to, some false.
It's a whole cottage industry that's grown up around that, right?
Yes, you purchase fake urine.
Yeah. But honestly, I feel like, I'm sure that's a problem, right? You're always going to have cheaters, fakers, stuff like that. You're always going to have that. And so I understand the merits of closing that loophole to some degree. But if the detectability is this roughly the same as urinalysis, I mean, I've always been a supporter of the hair follicle, not because it's just a different type of test, or it's certainly not more affordable. If anything, I think it's more expensive and probably more difficult to administer, but it is more accurate.
Yeah.
Or can be. And I think that's the concern. It's more of a safety issue.
I think the evidence is clear that it certainly results in more positive test results than urinalysis. I think the data supports that more.
Why do you think I shave my head?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. What
are you hiding now on that?
Yeah, exactly. But there have been pushbacks on it, from what I understand, including making sure that we have guardrails up for drivers that don't have any hair and stuff like that. How are we going to treat all of this? How are the labs going to be certified to do those types of tests? And it just hasn't moved forward from a regulatory standpoint. I think if nothing else, the FMCSA should at least consider allowing the results of a positive hair test result to be reported to the Clearinghouse as actual knowledge of drug or alcohol testing, or drug or alcohol use, or drug use specifically, which the DOT doesn't allow now. But I think that should be open for consideration.
I think that is a fair point, and agree wholeheartedly. So I know we got a new administration coming. So anything in your mind that we can expect, from a regulatory standpoint for the next 4 years, other than no real regulatory, less oversight maybe?
Well, I think that's the general consensus of what we can expect. We have a rubric here to go by because Trump was already in office in the past, and we know kind of how things played out from a regulatory standpoint, at least on the FMCSA during those 4 years he was in office. And so, a couple of things I think we should expect. As is true with most Republican administrations, you can generally expect to see a slowdown in federal rulemaking activity. Folks may recall that when Trump took office in 2016, he had his 2-for-1 rule or policy, which was essentially a directive to all federal agencies, FMCSA included, that, hey, if you're going to propose a new federal rule, for every one new federal rule that you want to enact, you have to target 2 existing federal rules to get rid of if you want to move forward with your rulemaking. So that dissuaded federal agencies, including the FMCSA, from pushing new rules forward, because they'd have to get rid of 2 existing rules. So I haven't heard whether Trump is. I don't think he's made any announcements of whether he expects to do something similar this term, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did something like that. So, my general feel is that we will see rulemaking come to a halt for the short term, and then we will probably see a scale back in FMCSA rulemaking activity over the next 4 years.
Do you think this has any bearing or could have any bearing going forward on just the ongoing independent contractor issues that obviously the pendulum swung far one direction. I don't know how it changes. It's certainly not going to get worse, I wouldn't think. At least for a few years.
It's been whiplash over the last several years on the independent contractor front. Not really my area of expertise, but even at the FMCSA level, we've seen them go back and forth in the one small area where this touches on FMCSA safety regulations, which is meal and rest breaks. So the hours of service rules under the federal rules, mandate a rest break, a 30-minute rest break of commercial drivers. And we've seen when Trump was in office, we saw the FMCSA kind of sweep in and say that its hours of service rules preempted California's and Washington's state meal and rest breaks, at least as applied to commercial drivers operating in those states. And then when Biden took office, we saw the FMCSA start to distance itself from that earlier ruling that it itself made. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we saw a return to the Trump era of being firm in FMCSA saying that those state laws are preempted by the federal laws. So I suspect that may happen. And then certainly from a Department of Labor standpoint, usually you can expect with the Republican administration some more favorable rulings on the independent contractor front. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, more favorable or less unfavorable. All is
more favorable
welcome.
to carriers.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's your sense on this being the end of the 2+ year long freight recession? Are you certainly there's some optimism out there, but there's always been some optimism out there. It's just never come to fruition. But are you getting the sense that maybe has changed? What are you hearing?
Yeah, just from the news that I read on it, I don't keep up much with the economics of trucking as much as I should, but that's the general sense that I've got just from reading some industry news on that topic specifically. So.
Right. Yeah. I saw an article recently that says it's over. So I'm like, all right, let's pop the champagne.
Yeah, that seemed pretty affirmative.
So, well, we can will it to be, right?
Yeah,
that's what we'll do. Now, this isn't so much a question, just as a statement of gratitude. As you know, I recently kicked off a movement, a passion project called Project 61, and 61 being the average life expectancy of a CDL driver. And I really appreciate the industry-wide support of this movement. But and there's certainly a lot of work to do. But I bring it up because I want to thank you for participating in the ongoing 61-day step challenge and for just being a supporter of Project 61 in general.
Yes,
it's going to take all of us.
But yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a great initiative, and thanks to you for putting that together. And I need to step up my step game. Looking at that app and the number of steps that people have in that makes me sad for myself.
Well, and while we're talking about that real quick, because obviously it's the drivers where the issue is most acute, right? Like, they're the ones that we're talking about, with the 61-year life expectancy. But frankly, all of us in the industry, and really everybody in America for that matter, this is a challenge of just being more active and being more thoughtful and mindful of what you eat and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the reason why I'm bringing that up is with that app, there's a lot of times I'm talking to a carrier and they say, this is great and I want to get my drivers in it. And what I've always encouraged them to do is create your own group as a carrier with your own drivers. And that's way better because it's intimate with just your company and everybody. It's it's engaging that way. And the main reason is I don't want them to have the same feeling that you have. If you're an over the road driver, how many steps are you going to get on a daily basis? I mean, a few thousand might be tops, and it's deflating if you see people hitting 20s.
Oh yeah.
So
I think you had some people in there the other day that had run a marathon or something. I saw those numbers. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, here's what I know is if you run a marathon, you could get between 56 and 72,000 steps in a day. That's insane.
That's nuts.
So what's next? What's next for TruckSafe in 2025? Any big plans?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to push out a lot of content over this next year. We've got a lot in store for that. We just finished up our TruckSafe Fleet Compliance Boot Camp in Indianapolis this past October, and that's our in-person conference that we put on once a year where we bring in fleet safety professionals to spend 2 days talking about nothing but DOT safety regulations, believe it or not. And so we're going to plan another one of those for next year. So we're kind of in the early stages of that. And just a lot of content.
Do you know yet where that might be, or is that still on the docket?
I'm open for recommendations if anybody has them.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who have enjoyed Brandon's voice and his content and his expertise, I would encourage you to engage and dial into his podcast. Where do they find you there?
TruckSafe Live is the name of the podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast. It's a live show. So if you want to join us live and, ask your questions, give us your thoughts, you can do that over on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever you want to watch.
Super good content. Always great seeing you. Thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate your friendship, your leadership, and as I said, your support and participation with Project 61.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for taking the higher road with me. Once again, special thanks to the sponsors of this show. We really appreciate you. If you're interested in being a sponsor or joining me for an interview, please email Jeremy at takingthehigherroad.com. Until next time, thank you for taking the higher road.